So hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this edition of Soccer Hub Talks. It's edition a bit different from the usual. Will not be talking about the game itself, not the technical side of the game, but more the strategical part of the game and how does the COVID impact this game, mostly in Southeast Asia. So don't forget that this is a live webinar, so you will be able to ask questions. You just have to introduce the questions on the chat box, and then I will select some to be asked to our speakers. So we are here today with Dr. Leanne Jones. She is currently Chief Executive Officer at Immunotechniques, Singapore. She's also Head of Training of Oxford University Clinical Research Unit in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and also the Director at Harcus Consultancy Group. Together with Dr. Jones, we have Richard Harcus. He is the CEO at Harcus Consultancy Group, as well as a qualified intermediary, Masters in Sports Management, UEFA coach, and IPSO Elite Scout. So they are both very experienced in this specific market in Asia and Southeast Asia. So we will be talking exactly about that. So the idea is to discuss the impact of the COVID in Asian soccer and what will be the future of these sports in Asia after COVID. So I will introduce our speakers in just a few seconds. So hello, Dr. Jones. Hello, Richard. Welcome.
Hi. Hi, Ricardo.
Well, first, let me thank you for accepting Soccer Hub's invitation to be here and share with us all of the rich knowledge that you have about that specific market. I would like to start with the first question to Dr. Jones. I would like to know if you can tell us what is the actual situation about the effects of COVID in Asian soccer, and if you believe if the clubs are able right now to make the changes so they can come back to work. So the current status, and if you believe that the clubs are now adapting to this reality so they can back to work as soon as possible, Doctor?
Yeah, so the situation across the region obviously varies a lot depending on what country we're looking at. Obviously, Asia has faced the pandemic a lot earlier than Europe and the US. So we are at the end of what we see as the first or second wave and coming out the other side. Obviously, Europe and the US are still suffering quite a bit. But even within the region, we're seeing a lot of differences in how countries have been hit and also how they've been dealing with the pandemic. So as an example, obviously in Vietnam, things are very stable now. We're at just over 300 cases, no deaths, and very little evidence of community transmission. So it's a very stable situation. Singapore is another example, started off very well in the pandemic and have now unfortunately had quite a high number of cases related to some foreign workers. So they're in a slightly different situation now. Taiwan and Korea responded incredibly well to the pandemic and were one of the first countries hit. And they are now at a stage where they've started their leagues back. So they have started playing games already with no fans in the stadium. Vietnam are looking at the possibility of starting their league back in the next couple of weeks. They may start to allow some fans in. So the reaction of each country in terms of starting back football has to be very dependent on how the country itself is coping. Also, testing facilities they have available. When the teams go back, it may very well be that they're going to have to test their players and test them frequently. Germany are already doing this, and Korea are already doing this. Vietnam would have to make sure that either they have enough tests to do that, or make sure that they are happy that the risk of community transmission is so low that perhaps they do not need to go down the regular testing route. But as I said, it's going to be very dependent for each country.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I had one question, but now I have here a question from Olof that I'm going to ask straight to Richard. Richard, do you believe that this situation may help the talent development and the status of youth football in Asia?
I think you could either go one of two ways, and then of course in a situation like this there might be another way that we haven't even thought about. The reason for this is that you have many players that were on bigger contracts in certain clubs in Asia, not necessarily Southeast Asia, that were on big wages that the clubs may not necessarily be able to afford these players. Also, you've had a lot of what they would consider foreign players playing in Southeast Asia now leaving clubs, and as a result those slots are being filled or potentially filled with players from that given country. So yes, that does give an opportunity for those players. It certainly bloods them into the team and makes them play potentially earlier. Are those players ready to go in? Then only time can tell, and then obviously it would be a case-by-case scenario. So in a perfect world, I'd like to say yes, but the reason that there are players taking those slots is because that club or that country, for whatever reason, feels that they don't have the best youth players. So if it encourages clubs to invest more in youth facilities, then certainly I would say yes. But if it encourages players clubs just to bring in players just because they have to fill the gaps, then certainly no.
Okay. Richard, my question to you is about, well, the financial situation of the clubs. How are the clubs coping with the fact that their competitions were stopped during so many months? And what do you believe that is the impact at the financial level of those clubs, Richard?
I certainly think, again, from country to country, there is going to be a certain effect on it. I think commercially, there's going to be there is an effect because there is now when sponsors will reevaluate the sponsors that they paid and look to get money back or get money back if they were to then go on for next year's sponsor. Also, with broadcasting and media rights, there's certain companies that are now reevaluating what they paid and looking for to pay a less amount. And now that they pay a less amount, this will have a knock-on effect because the budgets were already drawn up in place for particular clubs. But it's difficult in Southeast Asia to then compare, say, the Singapore League with the Malaysian League, with the Lao League and Vietnamese League and Thai League, because each one of those leagues are different in themselves anyway. They benefit. Some benefit from large attendances. Some benefit from large sponsorship deals. Some have large sponsorship and attendances, and so it's never really a one-size-fits-all solution. And that's when things are positive in Southeast Asia. So when you have a negative situation like this, it requires a whole new train of thought and a different way to try and tackle the problem.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Dr. Jones, we were discussing this before we went live, but can you tell me what will happen if there is detected infection in a specific club? Will they suspend the player, the championship? In your opinion, how much are the players risking going back to work? Is that an effective risk that they are taking?
Yeah, so I think what will probably happen and what has been indicated in Taiwan and in Korea, and I think Germany as well, that they'll be testing these players regularly. I haven't been able to find what they exactly mean by regularly, but they're going to be testing these players over time to make sure that they are not infected with the virus. Now, if a player is infected with the virus and this then becomes what we call an F0 case, they will then look for the contact with that player. So that would obviously mean his teammates in the first instance and also his family. And what has been reported from Germany and Korea is that if a player is infected, then the likelihood is the whole team will need to go into quarantine, self-quarantine for 14 days. Now, obviously, if this happens to one club and it's an isolated incident, then it shouldn't have that much of an impact on a league. If it becomes a situation where this happens to a number of clubs, then the league may then be reevaluated. Like it would then be seen to be a risk that's not worth continuing the league. Now, in terms of the players individually themselves and the risks that they face going back to work, the main risks aren't so much during the game itself. The contacts that a player has during a game. Now, we know it's a physical sport, we know it's a contact sport, but those short contacts are seen as relatively low risk when it comes to infection with the virus. Things that are higher risk is being in the changing room beforehand, sharing showers, sharing meals, sharing team buses. And these are the sorts of things that clubs that have already gone back in leagues like Korea and Germany are already taking this into consideration. So simple things, for example, the players will not be using the changing rooms together. They will be asked to put their kit on separately, maybe even at home. They will be asked to go home to shower. They won't be having group showers or in any close proximity. So basically any of the social distancing that can happen off the park will be put into place. On the park, they will be asked not to share water bottles. So they will have personal water bottles at the side of the park, for example. They will not be able to shake hands at the start of the match, and they will be asked to refrain from goal celebrations that mean that they are hugging, embracing, jumping on their teammates. But the actual game itself, I would say, is fairly relatively low risk. It's everything that goes around about it that needs to be considered, and frameworks need to go in place to ensure those risks are kept low. In the same way as you would in any other work situation, you need to look at the risks and take measures accordingly.
Doctor, I have a personal question. Me and my friends usually we play football at Tuesdays night. So we were about 10 players. We use the same locker room, of course. Do you believe that it's safe that we should go back and play again if we don't use the locker? You believe that it's safe for us?
So there's a few different things you might want to consider. The locker rooms, if they're very small and very cramped and you're very close to each other, I would say for sure you want to avoid that. If your facilities are indoor or outdoor is another question. There's a lower risk outdoor than there is indoor. But as long as you're trying to maintain, and it's hard, and I know it's hard when it's a team sport and there's a bunch of guys together and there's camaraderie and stuff, but if you can try and maintain social distancing outside the physicality of the actual game, then it's a lower risk. Again, your risk is going to be dictated by the country that you're in. Okay. So if, for example, you're in a country where there's a lot of community cases, then the risk is going to be higher. So that's why it really is going to be an individual country to country basis on whether those games will be going back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jones. We have here a question for Richard from Juliento. He's asking if his Asker Consultancy Group also have a client in the Indonesian market. He's asking if you know the Indonesian market and how he's looked like our football industry in Indonesia after COVID-19, in your point of view, Richard.
It's a great question. First of all, so yes, I do work with people in Indonesia. If you go into our social media, then you see that there is quite a bit of conversation. We speak to a couple of clubs in Indonesia. Recently, also from last year at the World Football Summit in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, we spoke a lot to clubs from Indonesia. Regarding the commercial problems or how from a fan engagement, you may see it certainly change early after COVID-19 due to the fact that certainly you look at Indonesian matches and they are, for want of a better expression, probably one of the craziest fans for football in Southeast Asia. The amount of fans that you have at Indonesian matches is incredible, and they truly are one of the greatest clubs, one of the greatest countries in the world when it comes to fans coming out to games.
Okay.
What you might see improving is the fan engagement from the clubs and safety aspects brought to clubs, to fans going to the facilities, which, to be fair and being completely honest and speaking from my heart, is something that is needed in a lot of Southeast Asian countries where they have massive amounts of fans, but very small amounts of fan engagements and safety for the fans. So I think from a fan engagement point of view, it's certainly going to get better. If you look at Malaysia, for example, I know that in Vietnam and Malaysia and in some clubs in Indonesia, when they're wearing face masks, they're now branding the face masks. So this is I would say from my point of view, an early indication to see how clubs are embracing the opportunities that to find a positive that might come out of this bad situation. And also Indonesian clubs very much are, if anyone's ever seen, say, Bali United or Persijap or any of these clubs, they have a huge amount of sponsors on their football tops. I don't think that's anything that will change because of COVID-19. I think that, and they won't see an increase, certainly, of the amount of sponsors that they have on the tops, purely because those sponsors, they have more sponsors to obviously to make more money, whereas bigger clubs, you know, like Manchester City, they have the front, they have the sleeve, and they may have one on the back. Whereas, as my friend here in Indonesia asking the question, he'll know that, you know, you have sponsors all over the top, which is the same for a couple of the club countries in Southeast Asia. I don't think that'll change. So commercially, also depending on the country, if you're looking at Indonesia, they are getting more media attention and more people are beginning to watch on TV as they are because they already have a massive amounts go into the stadium. So I don't want to sound disrespectful to the virus and say I see a lot of positives coming out of it. I think because of a business that I run as a consultancy firm, I always try to find the positives. And certainly in this situation, it's difficult to say I'm looking for beneficial things to pull out of this terrible situation. But I think Southeast Asia certainly may find more benefits in the same way that with Vietnam going back on the 5th of June, and the V-League goes back just after that. V-League 2 goes back just after that. And they go through until October and the end in October because they're wanting to find more time to spend on the chances of the national team. I think if other clubs in Southeast Asia adopt these same policies, this will be beneficial to not only the clubs but the national teams as well. So I think kind of, and to summarize my answer, I think there's certainly going to be changes, and I certainly hope that there'll be more positives than negatives.
Okay, Richard, we will go back to that about the subject. What will be better after the COVID? What can we look for of the positive things of this virus? But before that, Richard, I want to ask you something. Okay, you are saying that, and it's happening the same here. The media are not taking the TV rights. The sponsors are not taking the sponsorship. But of course, we don't have people at the stadiums. Which of the countries over there is more dependent of the ticketing revenue that will suffer a bigger impact because of that? Do you know which country is more dependent of that kind of revenue, Richard?
It's difficult to get an exact number, and when you work in football in Southeast Asia, it's always difficult to get a specific number on specific factors that are inside football here. Probably one of the best expressions that I heard was that football in Southeast Asia is a very delicate ecosystem. And you can look at some countries. If you look at JDT and Selangor in Malaysia, they have massive facilities, massive stadiums, and massive support. I touched on it as well in Indonesia. You have massive facilities and massive stadiums and a massive amount of support. But also in those countries, you can have smaller stadiums and smaller support. So in order to say that the money is just coming in because of the ticket prices or because of the amount of tickets they're sold, it's certainly not the same scenario as if you were looking at a club in the English Premiership, for example, because the English Premiership, They look more to their sponsorship revenue and their media revenue. That's what's bringing in the more money for them, certainly the Sky TV revenue and stuff like that. Yeah. Whereas in Southeast Asia, depending on the country, it's local TV networks and also the larger Fox Asia and other similar media companies, of which many of those media companies are strictly controlled within inside the country and they don't broadcast outside as well. I think there's going to be an increase. There certainly has been an increase, I know, in merchandise and sales because people have felt that they want to be closer to their teams. I know that's been the case in Malaysia. I know that's been the case in Indonesia. In the past, just to go back to attendances, some stadiums in Vietnam in the past, you had a situation, and we're going considerably further back, where people were paying for fans to go to stadiums because TV revenue was only going to pay a certain amount if there was a certain amount of fans in the stadium. So in order to get that money from media, they had to pay that money out to get people into the stadium. That is now been changing. The V-League is working hard to rebrand the league and bring more fans into the stadium. And they were doing this before COVID-19 happened. So it's difficult to then compare any of those numbers because they'd really just started with the new market. And Singapore, with all respect to Singapore, they suffer greatly with attendances. And their attendances were in decline and have been in decline for quite some time. I'm not sure how much COVID-19 is going to make a difference to that because, with all respect, they certainly have a large degree of social distancing in the stadiums already as before COVID-19 came out, if you understand what I'm saying. So, which is a great pity because there is a great product there on show and more Singaporeans should come out and watch Singaporean football. So, collectively as a whole, the commercial side, I think that the clubs are going to make more money. I think fans are also dying to come back to football here, and the fans just basically want to come back. I know in Singapore, again, to go back to Singapore as an example, Tampines Rovers had hundreds of fans turning up outside stadiums to support the team when they were playing behind closed doors at the beginning. Yeah. And that shows the desire of fans in Southeast Asia to go along and watch games. I know in Vietnam, they're desperate to go back, and that's the V2 as well as the V1. I'm certainly on a lot of the forums all the time, and everyone just wants to get back to football, the same as everywhere else in the world. And it's interesting that people's opinion about when I speak to people about football, and they say, "Oh, it's great that German football's coming back," and I always answer, "Well, Taiwan they've been playing right through in April, and Vietnam comes back at the beginning of next month, and South Korea's already gone back." And what South Korea have done is very interesting, that they have now benefited from people in Europe that want to watch football, that are desperate to watch football. So they're able to actually sell their football to other countries that wouldn't normally be watching football, Taiwan to a lesser extent. And I certainly hope that Vietnam will be able to capitalize on that, as we only really have Germany playing football just now as well. But you have a massive population, 644 million people in Southeast Asia alone dying to watch football again. Yeah. So if that can bring more fans to the Vietnam game, even better.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Richard. Doctor, let's go to the fans. Richard was touching some bases about it. But my question to you is, do you believe that, or when do you believe that it's going to be safe for the fans to go back to the stadiums? And even, because we're talking about a lot of that about tourism, even if it's safe, we still have to make people comfortable again so they can go back, So the question is, when do you believe that it's going to be safe to go to the stadiums? And even though, if everything is safe, if the people will feel comfortable enough to go back.
I'm glad this question isn't for me. I'm glad this question is for the doctor.
So, to finish this question, do you believe that things in the fans' point of view will never go back as they were before, Doctor?
Okay, so the first question is when do we think fans will go back? And it is the age-old question. So I think, as I said at the start, if you have a country where community transmission is low, like Vietnam, I think the fans are going to be back in the stadium very soon. I think it's a matter of weeks rather than months. And I think that will happen quite quickly. Okay. I think there's going to be a lot of measures put in place. There's going to be a lot of hand washing facilities around. There's going to be a lot of hand gel. You will probably have temperature checks going into the stadium. In terms of Vietnam, they have a very good government phone app where you can declare your health status. My guess is they will probably utilise that for fans too, so that you will have to declare your health status before you go into the ground. I think the seats will be limited. I think they will probably try and cordon off certain seats, maybe every second or third or even fourth seat will be closed, and they will allow fans in an organised manner. There won't be a crowd of people trying to squeeze in the door. It's going to have to be in a very organised fashion, and the same way when the fans are leaving as well. So I definitely foresee that being the case in Vietnam. I think it's going to take a lot longer for countries where they still have a significant level of transmission. Okay. Actually, what happened at the start of the epidemic or start of the pandemic was quite interesting in Japan. So the start of the pandemic in Japan, where we were aware of coronavirus, but the world hadn't really gone into lockdown yet, the Japanese league were asking fans to sanitize, wear masks, enter in an orderly fashion, complete health checks and do temperature screening. So that was already in place before the leagues closed. So there are some leagues that are already prepared to roll that out again. Now, there was a situation in Japan where one fan actually did test positive shortly after one of the games. What was interesting is there didn't seem to be a cluster outbreak caused by that fan, which was good. And I think teams and leagues will be very aware that they don't want that to happen. The minute there's a cluster of outbreaks, it's going to be a worldwide shutdown of football potentially. So they're going to be doing this in a very careful and very measured approach. And it may very well take a long time before stadiums are up to capacity again, particularly in some countries. In terms of whether the fans will be comfortable going back, I think that's going to be a very cultural thing. People's memories are often very short. Often people, once life starts to go back to normal and once restaurants and bars and public transport are reopened, people tend to slot back into real life fairly quickly, which is frightening in itself because we need to make sure that people are kept aware that this isn't going to disappear overnight, and we may very well have little peaks and troughs of cases. But it's going to be very important, the communications from the football clubs as well, the football doctors, the physiotherapists, the club itself, the players are going to have to be very on point in their messaging. And I think it'll be interesting to see how clubs actually do that. And I think they're going to be very open and vocal about this, what they're going to put into place to make sure that fans are safe. You know, nobody wants to throw their doors open and run an experiment where people could be in close proximity to people that are infected. So, it's going to be an important job in terms of communication with the clubs, for sure.
Thank you, Doctor. We have here another question for Richard from Paul. Is football really football without fans? And what's the impact and or the opportunities for sponsorship that come from sports behind closed doors, Richard?
Well, obviously, that's a great question by Paul. Paul's in a great position to know that as well, as he runs a very successful market and sponsorship company in Thailand, and a lot of information that Paul's been coming out with has been really quite useful to many people in many football circles across Southeast Asia. So, obviously, with my first to answer the first point, it's difficult without fans. I think everyone would agree Certainly for me, it's difficult to not go to football. It certainly doesn't feel like a Saturday if you're not going to the games. It's hugely difficult. And the second point with regards to sponsorship, if the stadium's not there, if the fans aren't in the stadium, as I touched on earlier on, I think there's an opportunity for some brands to reinvent themselves and for clubs to reinvent themselves through those brands itself, because rather than looking at it being a problem, it should be there's an opportunity to look to the benefits and the different ways that the clubs can benefit from this and the brands can benefit. There's community engagement programs, there's fan engagement programs. I spoke to a couple of companies and insurance companies that are looking to see if they can better their network and their database by reaching out through community outreach programs. And rather than everyone just looking at it as a negative that the brands aren't in their face at the football stadium, it's a way to try and to partner up with clubs and see how we can get those brands out to people through the various other ways that the clubs are trying to speak to their fan base, and certainly also increase their fan base. And if your brand can be related to and put in connection with one of these clubs that are doing progressive ideas in the communities, marketing in the communities, helping to develop the club and the infrastructure, then many brands will want to be part of that. So I think that a lot of the brands should look at this and look at what the positive effects could be to be associated with clubs that are forward thinking. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom from a marketing point of view. There's many possibilities that are there.
Richard, let me just add something about that subject. I believe that is a huge opportunity for esports. I think it was the first time here in Portugal that on public TV you were watching a match of FIFA. With people commentating the game, the match. So it was something like completely different. Then we had the MotoGP also. So I believe that one of the biggest challenges that clubs are now facing, and this is a great opportunity to do it, is to understand how to use esports to convert fans, mostly the younger fans.
Sure.
For instance, I have a son with 10 years old, and he prefers staying at home playing FIFA than going to the stadium. And he's a Porto fan, but he never bought a shirt or a hat or anything,
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a challenge to use that kind of technology and those kinds of systems to generate revenue for the clubs,
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%, and that's kind of what I was leaning towards on how brands can then maybe reinvent themselves, and clubs that are forward thinking can come up with ideas. I've watched Scottish games online and you've had players from one club playing against a player from another club representing the teams. You've had fans. You've had social media on Twitter where people have voted what team you think would have won that match, and you've got a couple of days to put your vote in, and then so the league structure would come out because of that. And obviously with people getting involved, so you've got your esports side and you've got the social media side, and you've got how the esports are promoted through social media and how it's really getting a lot of fan engagement. And 100% what you said as well, bringing in people that wouldn't necessarily go to matches or be interested in football. You're finding it they're getting more and more interested about it. But it's really, I mean, from a marketing point of view, commercial side, it's really exciting to see new ideas, and as ever, some of the best ideas are some of the most obvious ideas. And when you watch a player from one football team playing against a player from another team, and it might be two teams from completely different leagues, and you see the game, and I've watched games being commentated by official commentators, but it's I'm quite sad in that way that I watched a match for an hour and it was a computer game of two teams playing each other, and the commentary was superb. The opportunities to advertise stuff throughout it was really quite innovative and really clever. And yeah, as I said, the ideas that so many people are coming out with during this time is really quite refreshing, and it's great to see how positive minds are coming together and coming up with these great ideas.
Okay, thank you, Richard. My last question to both of you, and I will start with Dr. Jones. Doctor, what do you believe it's going to be better after COVID? Of course, I'm talking about football, I'm talking about soccer, about sports. What do you imagine that's going to be better after this?
Well, I mean, I'm obviously speaking from having a vested interest in Southeast Asia. I'm hoping that it's going to make a big difference to football here just because of exposure. I hope that they're going to take the chance to actually look at a new fan base, which would be great. I'm kind of hoping that it opens local fans' eyes again to their own leagues, so that they're not focusing quite as much on the English Premiership, for example. And I'm hoping it's going to create a real new passion and drive for actually seeing football live now that we've had it removed for a little while. You know, any improvements that can come from disease control from football is fantastic as well. Obviously, it's quite an unusual situation to have so many people in close proximity for that length of time and that frequently, you know, on a week-to-week basis. So hopefully we'll be able to come up with better strategies of making sure that, you know, fans are safer and grounds are better designed, and maybe that footballers are going to be more involved in health messaging as well, because there was an excellent marketing, well, I suppose you could call it a marketing campaign between, I believe it was FIFA, UEFA, but I'm sure Richard will correct me if I'm wrong, and the WHO, where they were having footballers talking about hand washing and, you know, how to cough safely and social distancing. And I think from a health perspective, the use of opinion leaders in sport is something that we don't do enough of, you know. So to get health messaging out there using athletes, footballers, football coaches is something that from the science perspective and from a health perspective, we could get a lot from. So maybe it's a lesson in that as well, and better communications from a health and science perspective.
Okay, Richard, you're a positive guy. So what do you believe it's going to be better after this? Let me just add something. I saw also, and I think that we should talk about it, some players giving some resources and money to hospitals, to different institutions, you know. So that's one positive thing also. We're talking about players not only for the performance, the sportive performance, but also for their ability as rich persons to give some back to the society. And what do you believe is more positive about all of this situation, Richard?
Well, I mean, for me, other than the fact that Dr. Lee Jones stole a lot of the answers that I would have said for it at the beginning, what I would also say is that people have many people have probably now realized just how important football is to society as a whole, and just how much we miss football when we don't have football, and you shouldn't take football just for granted. And that could be local football at your park with your friends, or that could be watching your idols on the football pitch. It's just how important football is to us. Also, I think that many brands will now realize that just how important football is to them also as revenues and a way to get their message out. Also, to back up and as an addition onto what Dr. Lee Jones was saying also, that the AFC have done a lot of good programs where they've been interviewing Indonesian players, Singaporean players, Thai players, both the men's teams and the women's teams, as well as the coaches, the sports scientists, and they've been using them in the health messages to get out to the people. So many people are now seeing more of their idols on television where they wouldn't normally be seeing them. So these players are given a rightful platform that they should be getting. So I think there's a positive that's come from that. And I think simply and very straightforward, the fact that we're able to have this conversation shows how much we all care. the new ideas that have came together were people to continue online coach education. So more coaches are looking online to find out information, where many coaches before may have not known about many websites that they can learn, such as Soccer Hub, of course, and now they have an opportunity, because they've been forced into that corner, to start looking for online education. So people are sharing more ideas. I've seen people sharing a lot of coaching curriculums. There's discounts on coaching courses, so more people are learning where to learn information. So operationally and educationally and commercially, I think there's been many benefits in football from what is, of course, a terrible situation.
Richard, perfect. Thank you very much for sharing with us. Dr. Jones, it was a pleasure meeting you. I hope all the best to you guys over there. And of course, you are always invited to come to Portugal and visit our lovely country. For now, it was a pleasure. Thank you for sharing with our community all of your knowledge, and I hope I can see you guys back soon. Okay.
Yeah, I'm glad. Thank you
so
to everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.